Hey guys, welcome back to SWAT Studs. Today we are going to start a new series of tutorials where I'll be covering lighting for animation and VFX from the ground basics. In this series, we'll be taking renders or photos from real world and we'll try to replicate the same lighting scenario with the available lights inside Maya. We'll be exploring each light and its parameters on the starting to see which light matches the lighting of that particular photo closely. So this tutorial is aimed for the total beginners who has no idea of a lighting inside a 3D software. Although this tutorial will be focusing more on the practical sides, I'll try to explain the theories behind it as much as I can. So any person who has no knowledge of lighting but have a basic understanding of any 3D software can follow these tutorials and learn the practical approaches of lighting we do in VFX and animation movies. And one more thing, even though the tutorial is with Maya and Arnold, as the lights present in all 3D softwares are almost the same, you can follow these tutorials with any 3D softwares you wish. So I'll be explaining that also in the tutorial. So let's start our first video with a simple scene. So for this tutorial, we will be going to do the lighting of this particular image. So from a first analysis, you can see this is not a single photograph which is taken from the camera. If we analyze the elements of the scene, we have a backdrop, we have a floor which is very reflective, and our main subject. So if we see the reflection, the subject on the reflection is not our main subject. This image has been composited in some post-processing software that two images were shot on the same lighting and the image for the floor reflection has been changed. So in here you can see that the chest piece on the reflection and on the floor is two different elements. So we will be focusing on the main subject here, not on the reflection, and we will be studying the lighting setup on this particular object. So if you look at this image clearly, you can see that when you see or analyze an image for lighting, the first thing you can look at is the position and direction of the shadow. So that will tell you how many lights and from which direction the lights are coming. So since the floor is totally reflective, we cannot see any shadows which is falling on the floor. Usually we will have, on most of the cases, a rough floor which will have some shadow information, but in this case we have mirror-like reflection which is not casting any shadows of the subject. So we have to judge the subject's lighting from the shadows which the subject has on its body. From the shadows which is falling on the body of the subject, you can have an idea about the direction of the light and the position of the light. Since you can see that the top positions of the object is illuminated and the bottom parts of the object is mostly on the shadows, you can see that the light is coming from the top side and the shadow goes from the right side to the left. So you can understand that the light is coming from the right side of the scene. So since we don't have multiple shadow lines in here, you can also understand that this is only a single light scene. For the starting of our series, I have chosen a file which only has one light or a single light present. So when you are studying lighting, you should always start with simple scenes with single lights so that you can understand the properties of single lights first, and it will be easier for you to judge lighting direction and intensity and all those things of lights easily when the scene has only single lights. So I advise you to start with simple objects and simple lighting setups so that you get a grasp of lighting parameters and how to set up a light easily. Once you are more familiar with placing lights and adjusting its intensity and direction and angles, you can replicate this on multiple lights. And this process is the same when we will be using multiple lights on the scene. That is the reason I'm starting with simple scene setup with a single light, and we can see how this can be replicated inside Maya. So for this lighting setup, we will be using all the lights one by one to see which light suits the lighting of this photo most closely. So that way you can understand the advantages and drawbacks of each light separately, so that you will in future, when you see a lighting setup or lighting scenario, you can judge quickly which light is going to be suitable on that particular scene. So that is what I am aiming to show you in this tutorial, so that you will get an idea about all the lights in Maya and how the properties of that lighting works, and which of the lights will have more advantages on particular lighting situations. So let's get into Maya and do the lighting for this thing. So I have already set up the scene here with a camera. So if I look through that camera, which is camera 1, you can see that I have already set this scene up. So I have also added the image plane to this scene. So let's enable the image planes here. Yeah. So if I see it on wireframe, I have closely matched this camera angle, the object, with our scene setup. So how we can create and match roughly a scene for lighting, that is like a topic for another tutorial. So I'll be explaining the process for setting up a lighting scene matching with a backplate or an image. I will explain this in a separate tutorial. For now, we will be focusing only on the lighting part. For doing the lighting setup, let me just disable this again. And for the lighting setup, mostly we just need to use only gray shaders. So this is important, that we don't need any particular shaders or textures to judge the lighting. So we can finalize the lighting around 80 to 90% with only gray shaders. So I'll also be showing you that how we can judge lighting in the gray shader itself. So let's start adding a light to the scene to start our lighting. Before that, let me show you the render settings which I am keeping for this scene. This is like a final quality settings which I have put for the lighting. When you're starting, you can just start with a lower values like camera samples 4 and diffuse and specular 1. And rest we have AOVs, which are mainly we need AOVs like diffuse albedo, diffuse direct and diffuse indirect, specular, direct and indirect if we are using any specular. So in our scene, you can see the object has some specularity. Also our floor has some reflection. So we will have to use the specular to get some information if needed to judge the lighting with specular. To judge lighting, just like we do it with the shadow part, the next thing we use to judge lighting will be the speculars which is casted by the light. So if you look at here, you can see the light is creating specular highlights on the object here, somewhere here, and mainly here and here. So this part is clearly showing the specular attribute, and all the other parts are not showing this much amount of specular, because I think the reason is the parts are varying in the levels of specular roughness, which means that these parts have more rougher surface than the bottom part and the top part. The top part is mostly like a metallic finish, because that's why we are not getting any diffuse information. Like here, these all parts are like white, and this is acting as like metallic, which is not receiving any diffuse color information, whereas it is reflecting the surrounding, which is giving the darker area here. So I think this is mostly a specular. So these are all something that you can observe on surface and get an idea about. If we are going to use any specular amount roughly to match the object, you have to keep an eye on the average of specular roughness which is overall visible on the object. And also the judging of the light may vary with the specular roughness, because if we are using any particular light, we can judge the light size by the specular amount if it is more a glossier object. So that also will be helpful, but we are not getting any that kind of help from this image. But in the later tutorials we can study how we can judge the lighting from the specular itself. For now, let's get back to the Maya and let's start with a single lighting inside Maya. So since I am using Maya and Arnold, we have separate lights which are default to Maya software and Arnold. So let's see the Maya lights first. So if I go to create menu, lights, you can see we have one ambient light, directional light, point light, spotlight, area light, and volume light. So all these lights have different kind of lighting, or it emits lights in different ways. That is why we have these amount of lights inside Maya, which can be useful in different lighting scenarios. And if I go to Arnold menu and lights, you can see we have the area light, which is the same as Maya light, Maya area light, and then again a sky dome light, a mesh light where we can convert any object shape to a light, a photometric light, light portal, and physical sky. So here we are going to use only lights like directional light, point light, spotlight, and area light. So the area light can be from Maya or the Arnold. It doesn't matter, we get the same parameters on both, but we have some light specific attributes more on the area light of Arnold. So we'll be probably using Arnold area lights. So why I am not mentioning about ambient light and volume light is because ambient light was a light which was widely used in Maya before the PBR or physically accurate lighting existed. So this one is not going to act physically accurate with the scene, so we can't use the ambient light. This goes same for volume light as well. So we will be avoiding these two lights for now, and we'll be focusing only on these four lights, because when it comes to a single light, this is the main four lights which are mostly going to be useful for this one. So let me first create a directional light. So the directional light is usually act like a sunlight. In different softwares, it is called directional light or distant light, which means it comes from an infinitely far distance. So unlike the lights on the real world, which is man-made like tube lights, bulbs, etc., this one doesn't have a point of origin. So you know that the bulb is giving light, the light is originating from the filament which is heated inside the light bulb. So that is the source of the light on that bulb. But when it comes to the directional light, it doesn't have a point of origin. So it only has a direction. So usually all the lights have a point of origin, a direction, a color, an intensity, then a fall off, etc. So these around 5 or 6 properties is the basic properties of any light. So we'll take a separate video on the light properties, because I am considering this is more like a practical approach. We'll be going through more of the practical sides of the lighting. So I'll reduce the theories of the lights or properties of light as less as I can. So we can move the directional light anywhere in the scene, but it is not going to matter because it doesn't have a point of origin. It only has a direction. So if I rotate the light downwards, the arrows which is pointed shows the direction of the light. So it will be coming from in an angle which is the locator of the light shows. So with keeping it this way, let's start a render and see how the scene is looking right now. So currently we have the light, and you can see that it is really a flat lighting. You can see if you see here, this light, you can clearly see that it is more intense than our current scene, and it is not, the lighting is not matching also. So how we can change the lighting? So we can change the light direction only by rotating the light. If I move it anywhere in the scene, you can see it doesn't make any difference. The parameter we have to change the light direction is the rotation of the light. So I'm going to the rotation, and I'm going to rotate it in the y direction first. So with rotating it in y direction, you can see the lighting is changing on the object, and we are getting some shadows also. So you can see that we are getting somewhere closer with the lighting. To match this lighting, I am going to load the object in the foreground of the image. So to load the image on the render view, you can enable the foreground, or you can add it in the background as well. But if we add it in the background, the image will cover it. So that is why I am enabling the foreground and adding the image by browsing it on our file browser. So from here, you can toggle the enable FG button and see if the lighting is matching closely or not. Now let's set the exposure of the light first. So to set the exposure of the light, let me just first add a shader, a gray shader for the objects. So I'm applying an AI standard surface here. And currently I am not going to use any specular on this element, and I'm going to use the 100% of the color, and I'm going to set the weight to 0.5. Now when I set the weight to 0.5, if I come to diffuse albedo, you can see the RGB values here shows a value of 0.5. So whatever we have given in the color with the weight comes in the diffuse albedo as it is. So if I go to diffuse direct, if I put the cursor on the highlight parts of the subject, you can see the RGB values is only around 0.154. So the luminance of the object is actually 0.5, which is what the value we have given with the color and the weight. So the weight value multiplies with the colors value. So that is why even though we have added a 1 value here, it is showing only 0.5 because we have given 50% of weight of the color to the object with the weight value putting 0.5. So if I put it all the way to 1, if I go back to diffuse albedo, we get 1 value here. Now you can put any other value here as you like. The only thing we have to check here is when we are setting the exposure, we have to match the diffuse albedo value with the highlighted part of the diffuse direct. So here we are getting a value of 0.126 or around 0.15. So I am going to increase the light intensity here. So even though we have an attribute called intensity on the directional light, I am not going to use it. I am going to open the Arnold tab on the directional light. I am going to use the exposure attribute of the Arnold for changing the intensity. So the exposure is a term which is widely used in photography, and the intensity and exposure doesn't work the same way. Intensity is a linear value and exposure is an exponent value, which means when I change the intensity from 1 to 2, the difference between the intensity is 1, and from 2 to 3, again the difference is 1. But when it comes to the exposure, the difference between 0 exposure to 1 is double the intensity, and then from 1 exposure to 2 is again double the intensity of 1, and then from 2 to 3 is again the light gets doubled. From a difference between exposure 1 to 2 is double, whereas the intensity value 1 to 2 difference is only 1. So if I put an exposure of 10 here, you can see the intensity gets very high because it gets doubled every time. And if I put the value 10 here, you can see it is not as intense as what we have seen with the exposure, because this is a linear value and this is an exponential value. So to match the exact intensity of 10 exposure here, you have to go like 2 to the power of 10, which comes when calculated is 1024, to match the exposure value of 10 in the intensity. So this is how exposure and intensity works. It is the same in all PBR lights and in any of the render engines or softwares we are using. So I'm going to increase the exposure up a bit to see how much values we are getting. So currently we are getting around 0.616, which is more than 0.5. So I am going to reduce the value a bit to get the accurate exposure, or the neutral exposure we say on photography, which is an exposure or amount of light which neither underexposes or darkens the object nor overexposes or brightens the object. It lights the object in the exact brightness which it should be. So that exposure is called neutral exposure, and that is what we are trying to create here. So when you don't have the shaders available for lighting and we don't know exactly the amount of light exposure which you have to put, we can start the lighting by creating this neutral exposure with the lighting. So for this one, we almost got the lighting RGB value on here like 0.535. So again, I'll reduce the value 0.1. So this one is more closer, like we almost gets 0.5 here. So this is our value. So if you don't understand this concept, you can eyeball it by going back and forth with diffuse albedo and diffuse direct. So to understand it clearly, let me just assign a different shader for the ground and the floor so that you will have a clear understanding of it on the object. So if you see the highlight part, you can see that when it is on neutral exposure, or the optimum amount of exposure for the object, the highlight part remains the same on diffuse direct and diffuse albedo, and the only difference between diffuse albedo and diffuse direct is the shadows. So this is how we first set the light exposure in any light inside any software. So this will be our starting point when we are setting up the exposure of the light in any situation. So now we can continue matching our shadows. So I am going to use a reflective shader for the ground. So I'm going to rename this as ground shader, and I'm going to add specular white of 1 and roughness 0. And for backdrop, I am going to use the material same as this object. So this is the chest component shader, and I'm going to use the same shader for the backdrop as well for now. Now you can see how the lighting is. So you can already see that the lighting which we have set is not enough to match the object lighting on this one, but still we are going to finalize the lighting exposure later. Currently our aim is to match our light direction accurately with this one. So here you can see, if you see this shadow, it has to come down a bit. So let us rotate the light. So when you move it in sideways, you can see the shadow goes upper, and when it comes more downwards, the shadow comes downwards. So the point is more closely matched, I would say, but still it has to come down a bit more. And now you can see this, the top point is matched almost, but the curve or the shadows lines on the bottom part is a bit different. This is more frontal, but it should go a little bit to the left on this lighting. So I am going to use the y-axis to rotate the light so that the light becomes frontal and shadow goes to the backside. So it's still a little bit more, so I'm rotating it again, and let's see if it is matched. So you can see we have almost matched the direction. If you want to go more precise with this one, you can try it on your own. For demonstration purpose, I am only going this far. So you can see all these lines are almost matched. So now even the shadow lines here is closely, I would say, not accurate, but closely matched. The accuracy comes when we have much better accuracy in this creation of the scene, in the creation of the camera angle, etc. So it all works together to create a more accurate lighting. So if we only have an approximation of accuracy, if we matched the lighting almost 90 to 95%, that probably will be good enough for our lighting. Now we have matched the lighting direction, but another property which you can see in real world is the softness of the shadow. So if you have observed this thing in any lighting situation or in a daylight, the sun, when it is in the morning lighting or in the evening lighting, the shadow of the sun will be really softer compared to the lighting is at noon or the shadow is at noon time. Because when the lighting is diagonal to the earth, the sunlight has to travel more distance, which creates this kind of softness on the shadows. So we have an attribute called angle in the Arnold tab for the directional light, which is for softening the shadow. So if I increase this angle, so before that, let me just save this part really quick. So with this icon, you can keep a snapshot of the render and you can adjust so that when we are doing multiple tweaks of lighting, we can get a comparison with the previous version, like how much the changes have happened. So it is a good practice to keep snapshots with each changes we do in the render itself. So it doesn't save the snapshots to the drive, it just keeps it only in the render view. Let me just increase the shadow now, and you can see that the shadows getting softer here. So comparatively, this was the shadow which was very sharp on the first render, and now it is really softened. So let's see if it is matching with our actual photo. So you can see the shadow is not that soft in the photo, it is a bit sharper than that. So I'll adjust it again, reduce it a bit and check it again. So this, I think, is a pretty good sweet spot we can keep. And now we can adjust the intensity again for getting that very bright object intensity as in the photo. So I am going to change the intensity to 3, which gives me a really sharp lighting which looks closer to that object. So one thing I am seeing here is that on the object the shadows are very dark, we are not getting much indirect light from anywhere to here, but in here we are by default getting a lot of indirect light. So that is probably because color intensity of the ground is brighter than it should actually is. So let me just reduce the ground intensity a lot, which you can see gives me more darker shadow areas. So when we are doing lighting, it is also important to understand the indirect bounces which casted from another objects. So just keep in mind that we don't fake anything in lighting at the beginning, which can cause a lot of problems later on the final lighting stages. So in the early stages, keep the lighting as simple as you can and as accurate as you can. So you can also change the diffuse and specular parameters separately. We have sliders to change or adjust each of the shader components separately in the lighting itself, but we are not going to touch this on the basic tutorials because that is not a physically accurate workflow to use. It's not like we never use this sliders, we use it, but only when we have no other options. But on the early stages, we always keep the lighting as accurate and as simple as we can. So you can see we have more noise on the indirect areas. So if I check the diffuse direct, the areas are more clean, only the shadow just have more noise. So when you can see noise in the diffuse direct or direct passes, which is diffuse direct or specular direct or any other direct passes, you can always adjust the samples of the light, which will increase the sampling of the direct illumination. So we get more noiseless renders of direct passes. And for the diffuse indirect and specular indirect, so we don't have much specular indirect here because we don't have any specular put for the shader for now. So for diffuse indirect, you can go to render settings and increase the diffuse samples. So we can see that putting diffuse samples to 2 reduces much of that noise right away. So this was how it was with 1 sample, and this is how it is with 2 samples. Really better noiseless image. So now we have only done the lighting with only 1 single lighting. Let's try a different light and see how the result is looking. Next we are going to look at another light called spotlight. So let's just hide this directional light. I'm not deleting it from the scene, so I'm going to hide it by pressing Ctrl and H on the keyboard, and I'm going to create menu, lights, and I'm going to select the second light, which is a point light. Sorry, I said spotlight, but you know, so we are choosing point light here. The point light is a light which illuminates light on all directions, like left, right, top, bottom, all the directions from this point. So basically it acts as a sphere which emits light from its surface to all directions. So it is in some softwares also known as omnidirectional light or omni light, which is another name for the point light, and in other render engines it is also known as sphere light because it has a sphere shape. So our Maya point light, we cannot scale this light, so we don't have an option to scale the Maya light locator. In other software such as V-Ray, we have sphere light which can be scaled, and with the scale it will change its intensity and the specular which is getting on our objects. So when a light becomes bigger, the specular highlight also becomes bigger. So that is not applied here by scaling this light. For scaling the radius, we have attribute in Arnold called radius, which will increase its size, but it will not be visible in the viewport. So we have placed it in our scene. So let's take a render and see how that light is behaving. So you can see that the light is currently only illuminating the top side where the light is closer to. So when I was working with directional light, I forgot to say one parameter of the light, which is the falloff. The falloff is nothing but with the distance, the light intensity gets reduced and at one point it becomes 0. So this is a property of all the lights except the directional light because it acts as sun. So it represents mostly the sunlight, which is millions of miles away from Earth, and it is bigger than the Earth. And since it is coming from a very far distance, we don't have a falloff for that particular light or the sunlight. So that is why in 3D softwares, distant or directional light doesn't have a falloff. All the other lights have a falloff, and for Maya lights we have a decay rate is another name for the falloff. So we had different types of decay rate algorithm in Maya lights before, but it doesn't work with any PBR softwares anymore. This was an older type which doesn't work right now. So by default, all the lights inside PBR render engines in Arnold, V-Ray, RenderMan, etc. uses quadratic decay, which is the physically accurate decay rate for light. The quadratic decay simply follows the inverse square law for the light intensity decay with respect to distance. The inverse square law states that the intensity of the light is inversely proportional to the square of the distance. So as distance doubles, the light intensity gets reduced to 1/4 of the intensity. So that is how quadratic decay works. Let's come back to the point light. So you can see that with placing it closer to the top part of the object, it only illuminates the object part. No other part of the object is getting any intensity or luminance from the light. So I am going to place it a bit away from the object, and I'm going to change the exposure a bit to get some intensity. So since it is an omnidirectional light which illuminates the scene from all the direction, rotating it doesn't mean anything. So there is no point in rotating it. We can just move the light to adjust its light direction. So this is another property which is unique to the point light. So just like only the directional light have no decay or point of origin, this property is unique to the point or sphere light or omni light. So we can use this light to illuminate lighting scenes where we have a filament bulb or a sphere object which is illuminating the scene. So for those kind of scenarios, we can use this light. So here again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to match the direction. So I'm not repeating the intensity setup for this light. I'm just setting it up on a value which later can be matched to our first render. Here you can see, if you see closely, we have matched this point here almost. So let me just pull it downwards a bit so that it more closely matches. Yep. And then we have to push the shadow line more backwards. So for that, we can bring the light more forward. So you can see the shadow is going backwards with lights bringing more forward, closer to the camera. So that totally changes our line. It went upwards comparing to our reference image. So let's move it up so that the shadow will come down. So I'm moving it on the y-axis, which gives me again that same lighting condition, which is matching closely with my lighting. Let me just do a region render fast so that I can adjust it faster. So we have matched this line and almost that line too, which should go a bit higher. Yes, close enough, I would say. So we yet doesn't know what kind of light they have used to create this image. So it can be a spotlight, a sphere light, it can be anything. So unless we place the exact same kind of light here, all the other lights will have some kind of variation from the original image, lighting and shadow, etc. So these kind of smaller changes can be acceptable as we don't know what kind of light is used on the real image. And what we are doing here now is we are trying all the lights we have to get most accurate lighting condition with a particular light. So we don't know which light gives that accurate information yet, so that we are trying every light we have. So this is one way to find out or get an idea about the lighting, to like which lighting to use on which lighting setups or which lighting scenarios. So if you are trying or studying the lighting this way, I think it will get easier for you to just look at a lighting scenario and judge which lighting or which lights are used where to create that particular lighting easily. For here again, we need to soften the shadows. So for softening the shadow, just like we had an angle attribute on direction light, all the other lights, if you think it physically, the shadows get sharper when a light gets smaller or a light is really far from the object. So because when the light gets far, the effective scale of the light to the scene gets smaller. So that is why when the light goes far, the shadow gets sharper. So in both cases, the light size is what matters to the scene, which affects the shadows to go sharper or softer. So in the case of here, we have already set the lighting to in a position where we get the accurate shadow lines on the object. So we cannot move this light far right now because we have find a good position for the lighting to match. Now we can adjust the scale to soften this. For adjusting the scale of the point light, we can use this radius attribute on the Arnold tab. So I'm going to increase the radius. You can see it softens the light a lot. So just like we did with the direction, to get more noiseless render, I'm increasing the samples to 3 and I'm reducing it to a level which is what we needed here. So I think this is matching closely. So let's do a full render and compare how much we have matched the element with the area point light. Sorry. So you can see this one also has matched the lighting almost like 90%. The only thing is you can see here this line hasn't matched correctly, and this was the same property here also. I think this is because of the model which I have used. This was modeled by me, and I think this is maybe this is not the exact accurate model. So that is why this is not giving me the exact line shadow just like every other part. So that is fine, because for demonstration we have achieved more than enough to get you an idea about how we can match the lighting. So this is our render with the point light. Now let's adjust the intensity as well a bit to get the higher intensity, just like the render. Yeah, too much. So I think this is a good place. So if I add a specular also with a much rougher value, you can see that the specular, if I go to the specular direct, you can see even the specular part is also mostly accurate with the light placement. We are getting the same specular spot on here as well, exactly where we are getting it on the reference image as well. So let's check this on directional light also. If you are getting the same, see, you are getting the same specular highlight on the spot. So we can create the same lighting setup with any light. It's just like I said, which light gives you more accurate information is what matters. So we have now seen direction light and point light. Now let's jump to the third light, which will be spotlight. So the spotlight, if you can see the shape of the light, has a cone shape, and this is something which is used in photography. So in photography we will have a light which is like a torch. If you see a torch focuses all the lights into a beam which will affect the scene only around in a circle, which is the same size as the radius of the cone of the torch. So the spotlight also works some way same as this one. So if I press 7 on the keyboard, you can see the lighting on the viewport itself. Let me just remove the specular weight from the ground and increase color a bit to see the lighting of the spotlight. So we have more control of the cone of the spotlight, with which adjusting its attributes we can get more controls on its radius. Like we can concentrate or focus this light only to a particular part of the scene. So it has a cone angle which controls the radius of the cone. So if I reduce it, the cone angle gets reduced. The penumbra angle controls the softness of the edges. So if I increase it, the edge softness increases inward and outward, and the drop off concentrates the light more towards the center. So these three are the main unique feature for this spotlight. And if I press D on the keyboard, we get a handle which is used to aim the light. So if I move it here, the light always aims to that handle. So let me just put it on the object itself, and I am going to move this to a side. So I am going to put the cone angle back to how it was. In our scene, if you see that we are not getting any specific cone area, we are getting overall illumination here. So we are getting some corner darkness all around, because I think it could be added after in the post processing. So this is not from lighting, because it doesn't usually happen from lighting like equally on all the corners. This is a lens effect which is called vignette, which is usually we add through other compositing softwares. What I was saying is that if we have used a spotlight like with this much of corner, we wouldn't be getting any light. If I render this, you can see we wouldn't be getting any light on the backdrop. So let me just increase the exposure to show you how the lighting is coming for now. So you can see only the area of the corner angle is getting affected by the light. So you can see from the reference image that all the area in the camera angle gets illuminated. So we have to increase the corner angle to get illumination for all the areas. And now again move the light and position it upwards, downwards to match with our reference image, just like how we did before. So now we have to move the shadow upward, so for that I am going to bring the light downwards. Again, render region will be useful for this one. Yes, a bit down. Much closer. Yes, so the lighting is much closer now. So just like we did before, we have to adjust the softness. So now if you are thinking like just how we see that changing the penumbra angle softens the corner, it will soften the shadow. It won't. It only works on the corner of the corner angle radius. It won't change anything for the shadow. You can see that on the viewport the softness is increasing and it doesn't affect the shadow because it is not a property for the shadows. It only works for the radius of the light. Same thing is drop off. Drop off works here because it is now concentrating the light onto the center, which is where we have pointed the aim of the spotlight. So we are not changing anything here for now because it is just like I said before, it is eliminating the overall scene. So to get the radius, we have a radius attribute in the spotlight as well, just like the point light. So I am going to increase this radius and we are getting that softness. So samples again to 3. A bit lower again. Yes. And more exposure. So here we kept the corner angle still low so that we are getting some vignette in here. So let me adjust it again to get rid of the vignette. So yes. So here you can see some shadow of the element, but here we are not seeing anything. I think it's because they have removed it in the post-processing. That could be the reason we are not seeing any shadows, because if it is showing in the software, that could be physically accurate and it should have showed in here as well. So this is the render where we have matched the lighting with spotlight also. So we have matched our lighting or tried this lighting with directional light, point light and spotlight. Now the last lighting which we have left is the area light. So I'm going to hide the spotlight as well. And now I'm going to create an area light by going to Arnold, lights and area light. So You can clearly see the view in the viewport a reflection as well from the light, which is the improved viewport of Maya 2022. And let me just put it on top of the object. And just do a render. So just like what happened with the point light, we are still facing the same kind of issue because the top part is getting more luminance and the bottom is getting less luminance. So let me keep it at a higher position so that all the objects from top to bottom gets an even illumination from the object. And let's just increase the exposure so that we get some intensity here. And for the area light, we don't have any radius or any other attribute to control the softness of the shadows. It is being adjusted with the light size. So if I increase the light size, the shadow gets more softer, and if I decrease the light size, the shadow gets sharper. So on area lights, remember that the shadow softness is with size of the light. And one other thing is that you have to make sure that the normalize option is always on for the area light. If it is not, changing the light size will increase the intensity of the light. So that is not something which is usually happens on the real world, because increasing the light size or area light size is done in the real world using softboxes. So area lights mimics the softboxes which is usually used in photography. So we have different sizes of softboxes available. So we can use the exact same light, which can be a bulb or a tube, and we can cover it with the softbox, which will soften the light. So in any size, the intensity of the light or the power or watt of the light remains the same. It just spreads the light. So it is important that to mimic the real world lighting situation, if you don't want to change the light intensity with light size, keep the normalize option on. Otherwise, if you want to make the light size affect the intensity of the light, you can turn this normalize option off. Samples to 3. Now we can rotate and move the light to adjust the lighting direction for this particular light. So as you can see, the shadows are very softer in this light. So I am again adjusting the intensity. So here what I am doing is before getting the accurate direction, I am setting up a level of softness accuracy in the area lights from the beginning itself. So you can do it as I have did for all the other lights. You can set the direction first and then change the intensity. It doesn't matter. So let me check this again. So the light shadow has to come down again, a bit more, close, but here we have more on the reference image. So let me just pull it back a bit. Much closer, again reducing size a bit more and increasing the exposure a bit more. So let's compare it now. Again, I think the shadow has to come a bit forward again. So moving the light backwards. Yes. Checking with the specular if we are still getting the same specular in the same position as in the image, almost closer. we have rendered the subject within all the lights. We have set the same lighting setup with all the lights. Now for the final decision, let's render all the objects with each light and compare to see which lights matches the lighting more accurately in all the 4 lightings. So before that, I have already created a shader for this one. So let me just add that shader so that we get more matching setup here. So you can see after adding the shader, the light intensity feels lower. So I am going to increase the lighting a bit more, and this will be affected in all the other lights as well. So I didn't use the shader in the beginning because I didn't want you guys to start lighting studies with the shader, because to study lighting or learn lighting, you have to keep practicing on the gray shaders itself, because that is where you go more observant with the lighting. Because when lot of colors and shade properties comes to play in the lighting, you get more confused with the colors and all. So when it is totally white or grayish and we only have to concentrate or focus on lighting, it becomes easier to judge the intensity, judge the shadow directions and everything, because we will not have any color cast, we will not have indirect bounces, variations and all. So it keeps the lighting scene very simple and easy to light. So that is why you have to practice only with gray shaders first, so that you get more focused and more confident with the gray shader lighting. And then once the shader added, the only thing you will have to adjust is just the intensity. You see, you don't have to adjust any position, any shadow direction, any radius of the light. That is all matched in the gray shader itself. You don't have to do any changes again on those attributes. It's just the intensity which is easily changed in the render or the compositing later. So that is why I didn't use any shader in the tutorial in the beginning. And in the later tutorials also, we will be using only the gray shading for studying the light. So let's put all these renders and check which one matches the lighting more accurately. So this is our final result with comparison to the reference image. As I have already told you before, like we were not exactly matching the whole image with the reference. We were only matching the subject's lighting so that you will get an idea about various lights which is used in softwares, and also how to change the properties of the light so that we can match the lighting with the reference image. So that was the main aim of this tutorial, because this is an introduction to the series of tutorials which is going to come in the future. This is just an introduction to basics of lighting, lights and its parameter. So that too was like just simply a touch on the surface. I would say we will explore more properties of light in the upcoming tutorials. So if you can see all these images, it is pretty closer to the lighting in the original reference. Just some changes I feel is that maybe some exposure and obviously some roughness difference is there on the shader, because we cannot completely judge a surface shader, because as I've already explained, like some of the part are reflective, like the top and bottom areas, and the middle area here is comparatively rougher than the top and bottom parts. So here we haven't used any separate texture maps for the roughness to get that variation in here. We were focusing only on the lighting part. Since the render is with the procedural shader that I've created, I will be giving you this scene file with the shader for free. You can download it from the link that I've put on the description. The lighting wise, it is matching closely, but only the thing is the dark areas are really darker in the reference, which is not that much dark in our file, but that is something that you can do in the post-processing, because if I make it more darker and with no details from the render itself, then later if we want to bring back some of the details in the shadows in the post-processing, we will not be able to do that. So unless we have some shadow information which is already in the render, we cannot get that information back. So it is always a good choice to keep some of the information on all the areas where we see that it is completely black, so that it is always adjustable in the post-processing, which is smaller, slighter detail adjustments. And rest of the image, I feel like it is pretty good matching. And one other thing which I have felt is that the lighting on the background surface is not that accurate on any of them, but that too they have done in the post-processing, or they have done some lighting. So if we want to create some extra lighting or the effect which is seen here, this can also be done in our lighting scene with some lighting tweaks. So we have to treat, if we want this kind of lighting differentiation, or if you want to match the exact lighting situation as the reference for the backdrop, you have to treat the backdrop in a separate lighting. So you will have to set a light separately for the backdrop so that it gives more brightness on the center and darkness to the edges. And then another thing which I've noticed is that our reflection on the floor is really brighter, as much bright as our subject. So that is only possible when the floor is metallic, like a complete mirror. In our lighting scene, what I created was a dielectric object, so that is why the reflection is a little dimmer than the actual image. So when you're doing it, you can tweak the shader of the floor to make it more metallic, so that you will get much more brighter reflections. So that is the only changes that you have to, try yourself. And with each light, you can see we get some highlights in different parts of the floor and the backdrop with respect to which light we are using. So these all can be controlled even further to get more accuracy in lighting. So those processes I will be explaining to you in the later coming tutorials. So this will be the final output of our tutorial. This is the final render with shader tweaks. Even though all the renders have the same level of information, I felt that the area light worked better when I was doing it the first time. I did a test lighting before doing it for the tutorial. So in that one, the area light was working better. And that also makes sense because in real world photography, photographers work with softboxes more. Also, I think spotlights will also work, as that also is used in photography for this kind of lighting. There seems to have an extra light for the backdrop to have a gradient from the center to edge. But for this tutorial, as we are using single light for the lighting, I have used a gradient in texture map to create that effect. So I hope you guys understood everything I just showed you. I hope it was useful for you to step into your lighting journey. If you liked the video, give a thumbs up. Share any feedback or doubts you have on the comments below. Subscribe to my channel for more videos like this in the future, and don't forget to share with your friends who are also interested in lighting. So I'll see you with another tutorial real soon. Till then, this is Swat signing off. Bye.